Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel Sportsbook. And then there was one. Only one football game remains on the National Football League calendar, and only one football podcast around these parts. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. But before we kick things off, we want to remind all of you, our loyal listeners, if you're in Louisiana, if you're in New York, or any other state where the FanDuel Sportsbook is available, there are all sorts of great new users incentives just in time for the Super Bowl. Whether it's a $1,000 risk-free bet, whether it's betting $5 on either money line at 56-1 odds, FanDuel has you covered. Rules and regulations do apply. And Payne, it's always bittersweet when we get to the Swan song and we know there's only one football game left this season.
It is bittersweet. I am happy it's coming to an end, but I certainly missed games this past Sunday. There's no doubt about that.
You didn't say fully entrenched watching the Pro Bowl from start to finish?
Didn't watch a single snap.
You're better off that way.
Not one. Now, I will say this. I didn't love this matchup, and this is a terrible way to start this podcast in terms of marketing and attracting people to this game.
Listeners have now turned off the show 2.5 minutes in as you've set things up quite nicely.
But didn't see like a ton of value on, the side or the total. I just wasn't completely interested in this game. And then all of a sudden, I had this mental conversation like a runner with like 3 miles to go. And it's like, stop being a vagina here. Okay, let's dig into this game. Let's mentally turn the corner here and start this game's awesome. Let's dig into it. Let's find something. And so there was this shift over the last 48 hours or so. Obviously, we've done a ton of prop work, but just in terms of like the game itself, we turned the corner about 48 hours ago. We're fully entrenched. We're here. Super Bowl 56, baby.
Do you want to tell the listeners the real reason why you don't care nearly as much about this game as you would have 2 weeks ago, say at halftime of the Kansas City Chiefs Cincinnati Bengals game?
I mean, certainly there was some financial stuff there for sure. There's no doubt about it.
Oh, great show nonetheless. Plenty of things to try and cover as we'll look at both sides of the ball, try and extract any value that still remains in the prop market. We spoke to John Sheeran earlier. Of course, that interview will be available later in the show. I think there's a lot of stuff that longtime listeners are going to find value in, as well as folks that are just tuning into the Bet the Board podcast for the first time. So when we set the stage on the game Sunday...
Hold on. Before we go ahead, the contest. We were just talking about this off air, and I completely forgot to give it out.
Well, I wasn't sure if you wanted to tease the contest now or you wanted to wait till the middle of the show.
Yeah, more people listen. When you look at the numbers, you get the initial trickle in here.
Yeah, not when you tell people the matchup didn't intrigue you, though.
Well, we'll do it twice, but we'll kind of vaguely mention it at the end again. But here we go. We're doing a Super Bowl contest. It's on Twitter. $300 Super Bowl podcast retweet giveaway. 3 people will win $100 each. All you have to do is go to Twitter, retweet the pinned podcast post on our Twitter feeds. I'll have the Super Bowl podcast pinned on my feed. Todd will have one. Our Bet the Board Twitter feed will have one as well. Retweet all 3. You get 3 entries into the $300 contest. Don't want to retweet all 3 and you only want to retweet once, you'll get 1 entry. If you retweet twice, 2 entries, so on and so forth. So you can earn up to 3 entries in the contest by retweeting all 3 pinned tweets on each of our pages. As soon as the game ends, we'll put all those people who have retweeted into a little simulator thing. We'll run it once. Top 3 people will be the winners. We'll announce that on the Bet the Board Pod Twitter feed at some point during the game.
And as always,
easy peasy.
Yeah, and as always, we want to thank all of you, our loyal listeners that have been with us from the preseason podcast all the way through the regular season and postseason. A little way for us to say thank you for those contributions. As we know, the podcast continues to grow. It gets in front of more and more people every single football season. And you guys, the Bet the Board army that's out there, are the reason why that's completely made possible. So as we get into the game, Payne, we know the combatants here. It's the Rams and the Cincinnati Bengals. The Rams, the de facto home team playing in their own building. despite not wearing their home jerseys. And this will be the second matchup in Super Bowl history to feature former number one picks going head-to-head. The last time it happened, Peyton Manning against Cam Newton, the one common denominator, of course, Von Miller, who happened to be MVP in that game. Meanwhile, Joe Burrow becomes the first quarterback drafted number one overall to lead his team to the Super Bowl within his first two seasons. And we went from last year, where we had the highest combined ages of two head coaches vying for the Lombardi Trophy, to this year, where it's really manifested in a youth movement. And when you're talking about the Rams as a 4.5-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook, total on this game sits at 48.5. There are so many unique storylines, whether it's Zach Taylor and his inability to get out of his own way through the first 2 years, suddenly going from a rags to riches story. Sean McVay trying to redeem himself for the Super Bowl that got away the first time around against the New England Patriots. I'm going to leave it up to you, whether it's figuring out if we want to talk about the Bengals offense on the field against this Rams star-studded defensive unit, or if it's the Matthew Stafford redemption tour up against the Bengals defense that somehow, by hook or by crook, has figured things out so far in 3 postseason appearances.
Before we get to the breakdowns of this game, in the matchups, in the intricacies, I think this is probably needs to be discussed. How has your timeline been, at least after each of the Bengals wins? Have the mentions been filled with a bunch of happy people? A bunch of Bengals fans coming for your throats?
The Joe Burrow bandwagon is completely filled up, and I think it's more expensive if you want to get a ticket on that bandwagon than it is to get in the SoFi Stadium. But, one thing that I have realized, and we haven't exactly heaped praise upon this Bengals team, whether it's this season or the last couple of years, Bengals fans haven't been nearly as vociferous for some of our disdain for all things Cincinnati as Green Bay Packers fans were, the shots that I've taken at them over the years. But amazingly enough, that fan base has gone extremely quiet since that 13-10 loss against the 49ers a few weeks ago. Go figure.
Whisper quiet there. So we have a lot of Bengals listeners, it would appear. And there was one thing that certainly pissed me off a little bit, because someone said that we were very unprofessional in our handling of the Cincinnati Bengals. And before, again, we get to the breakdowns and things, I think the Bengals have been a pleasant surprise. It's a really fun team. They're super easy to root for. Joe Burrow has a real chance to be one of the best quarterbacks in this league for years to come. And I think we've said that multiple times about Burrow. I think we've been on the Burrow bandwagon before most. And it's really impressive, right? Still on his rookie deal. The Bengals can make some serious moves this offseason. They got third most cap space. They can just keep adding to the roster, okay? And I get it. I understand it, right? Like, the reason this is the most popular sport in this country is it allows fans to feel like their team always has a chance, even if it's not realistic. And I can kind of understand what that means. I'm kind of a fan, right? I mean, I can remember going back to 2013 and thinking about the Florida State Seminoles winning a national championship and how it kind of comes out of nowhere. And you have this lead up to all the big games, and the stakes get higher as the season goes on, and it provides a little more oomph to life, right? So I get it. Like, this is awesome. Soak it up. In saying that, I think what our listeners love about us, Todd, is how we are real, how we are unbiased, and we don't really hold anything back in our coverage of these games and teams unless it's about one of 32, your favorite NFL team. And suddenly, your massive bias towards your favorite team, and in this case the Bengals, is now perceived as hatred from us rather than being real. So I think this is kind of a warning here. If you're looking to hear fair, unbiased, and real analysis on this game, keep on listening. If you want to be coddled as a Bengals fan, turn on ESPN, turn on Fox, really immerse yourself in some of that hard-hitting coverage of hey, Joe, is your chain real? Right? Go dig into that. Go dig into the Evan McPherson, Joe Burrow slob fest from now until the game. But I think if you kind of want to, listen to what we have to say, and just in general, right? The way we find value and underpriced assets in the market, and in this case, obviously, teams are the asset in the betting market, is by digging deep and uncovering things that happen in games that aren't reflected on the scoreboard or the win-loss column. It's fact. It's not us being unprofessional in our coverage. that the Bengals on their way to the Super Bowl have been outgained in every playoff game, okay? And I looked at this specifically this morning. In the 3 games the Bengals have been outgained in the playoffs, they've been outgained by more than half a yard per play. And it's against 3 teams that have an average power rating of 12th. The same power ratings that we have used this season that have allowed us to beat the market on 94% of our investments, okay? Meanwhile, the Rams have outgained all 3 of their postseason opponents and have done so by 1.24 yards per play. And those 3 teams have an average power rating of 6th. And we manually adjusted the Bucs down for their injuries, okay? That's why we've seen this game go from 3.5 on the look ahead to 4.5 as we speak. Now, it doesn't mean I'm betting the Rams. Honestly, Todd, I think we talked about this a little bit off air. Our true number on this game was Rams minus 4.5, minus 15. Right? There's really no value laying that price. Maybe there is something that materializes down the stretch on the money line, but nothing on the specific spread. So I just kind of wanted to set the stage there and how the market's moved a little bit despite more tickets on the Bengals. Right? We've seen Cincinnati be a +5 in turnovers during the playoffs. If that continues and Matthew Stafford turns it over a little bit, right? Good chance that the Bengals win the Super Bowl. We're sitting here talking about Joe Burrow a lot, and that's all you're going to hear in this coverage. And he does have ice in his veins. We told you that last go-around, right? He's played big in the biggest moments, and he's probably played in bigger games than Matthew Stafford, as crazy as that sounds. But when you start to think about some of these wins, right, even the AFC Championship last 2 weeks ago, Burrow's got a negative EPA per dropback in the second half against Kansas City, yet they erase a double-digit deficit. Burrow's got a 78 passer rating in the second half against Kansas City. Would have been substantially lower had Nick Bolton not dropped an interception. Yet we're crowning him as the second coming. So great quarterback. I just don't know if it's all there based upon what we're hearing perception-wise. So I guess my point in this, Todd, is we're going to break the game down fairly like we would any other game. We're going to point out where the Bengals have edges. We're going to point out where the Rams have edges. Kind of simple as that. Fair enough?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, look, we're not here to play favorites. If you do that in this business, you're soon separated from your bankroll, and it doesn't benefit us that are wagering on a week-in, week-out basis any more than it does a disservice to our listeners that come here looking for that unbiased coverage, trying to take actionable elements that we've isolated that they can use in their betting endeavors, whether it's for this game or a regular season matchup between Jacksonville and Cincinnati that took place way back when on a Thursday night. So I think it's a great point to bring up, and oftentimes public perception can lead you to find investments that otherwise wouldn't present themselves. And when you're talking about the Bengals, hey, look, we can start with Joe Burrow, who's gone 6-0 straight up and against the number the last 6 games. 73% completion percentage, more than 328 passing yards per game, a touchdown interception ratio of 13-2. That, of course, does not include his Week 18 game or the Bengals Week 18 game, knowing that Burrow sat that one out. He's done some great things since Week 14. The guy has been outstanding. He finished the Kansas City game, to your point, though, well under 7 yards per play, and 14 of 19 with making quick throws. He's not a guy that had a ton of time to sit in the pocket, survey the field, and spread it around like he did against the Baltimore Ravens. So when you're trying to figure out the offensive game plan for Joe Burrow to play to his strengths against this Rams defense, is it as simple, Payne, as trying to go empty and letting him get the ball out of his hand inside of 2 seconds so Aaron Donald, Leonard Floyd, and Von Miller aren't breathing down the back of his neck?
It does make sense, right? And even though Joe Burrow wasn't sacked a bunch in the Kansas City game, he was still pressured on 41% of his dropbacks. And that's the one thing we're digging into now metrically is pressure rate's great. It impacts the quarterback, but how much of that pressure turns into sacks? And so you have a team like the Rams who creates pressure and turns those into sacks. The Chiefs, on the other hand, create some pressure. They just don't convert a ton of sacks. We obviously saw Chris Jones botch 2 of them. But if you're a Bengals bettor here, the hope is Zach Taylor sleeping in his office for 2 straight weeks, right? He's up against his mentor, the guy that literally plucked him off the street. My understanding is he wasn't going to be working in the NFL in 2017 until McVay made him an assistant wide receivers coach. So Taylor needs to figure out, in my mind, how to not be so predictable. That's where this first starts in my mind, how to disguise things. And I think the mission gets tougher in terms of disguising if CJ Uzomah isn't 100% or is playing limited snaps with the MCL, which, again, by all accounts, wouldn't be playing if this were a regular season game. When Burrow's under center, it's a run. When Burrow's in shotgun, it's a pass. When you combine pass rates from shotgun and run rates from under center, there isn't a more predictable offense than Cincinnati this season. So something has to change here, right? This isn't just like we all hate Zach Taylor kind of thing, but this is why the sharpest minds who do this, both betting, analytically, watching film, don't think much of Zach Taylor, okay? Because if you want to run from center on first down like you did against the Chiefs every damn down, the Rams defense, unlike the Chiefs, is number 1 in the NFL in early down run EPA per rush allowed. Okay? Even formationally, the Bengals are predictable. When 2 receivers are on the field, 71% run. When 3 receivers are on the field, 33% run. You're literally tipping your hand all the time. The offensive line ain't great, but there's some things that Zach Taylor could have been doing throughout the course of the season that he hasn't done to help protection. 77% of the time the Bengals are in 3 wide sets, okay? No other formation is used more than 18% of the time for Zach Taylor. The Rams defense, they've allowed 43% of plays to grade successful this season from 3 wide receiver sets. 16 interceptions to 13 touchdowns allowed, sacked the quarterback 35 times. It's obvious, but you have to mention it. Rams are number 1 in pass rush win rate. Bengals are 30th in pass block win rate. It's been a problem all season. The key here, Todd, is I think figuring out what the pass game looks like for Cincinnati and how they're going to have to manufacture some things through the air. I know we can kind of dive into that, but I think if you're, a Bengals fan, you're going to hate hearing this again, but it's like they faced the easiest schedule of defenses this season. Second easiest by some metrics. They haven't faced a top 5 passing defense all season. And if you look at Burrow in his last 14 starts, he's played 1 top 10 passing defense. If you look at his last 16 games, Joe Burrow's played only 4 defenses that are league average or better in passing efficiency. And in those 4 games, Burrow's got a 2-to-1 interception to touchdown ratio, 47% success rate. He has a negative 0.14 EPA per pass attempt against those defenses. He's also taken 19 sacks in those games. Okay? The approach, kind of how that was the main question at the top here. The approach has been pretty simple, right? It's like get the ball out of Burrow's hands quick. And if you look at those 4 games against the above average pass defenses, Burrow's released the ball at a well above average clip. 11th fastest in one game, 9th fastest, 10th fastest, and then 2nd fastest release times of the quarterbacks that played in those 4 weeks. So if it's not a predictable first down run for Mixon, I would expect Burrow, to your point, to be in shotgun, to be in empty formation. Burrow does have a ridiculous 72% completion rate from empty sets this season, but it diminishes how effective the receivers can be because only 22% of Burrow's pass attempts from empty travel more than 10 yards. Burrow has a negative EPA from empty this season as well. This is really an imperfect system. Cincinnati's just so far ahead of schedule in this rebuild, it's nuts. You can still see these glaring holes. Ideally, you want to attack the middle of the field if you're Cincy, right? Weddle's a nice story, but they're covering for him against the pass. Taylor Rapp is a big question mark. Now, my understanding is we're going to see a lot more Ernest Jones this week, a lot less Troy Reeder, who's a liability in coverage. But if you get this domino effect of more Ernest Jones, Taylor Rapp back, CJ Uzama ineffective, that area of the field might not be as gettable. But I think like at its core, if Cincinnati's having success here offensively, Todd, especially through the air, it's because they're playing keep away from Jalen Ramsey. Wherever Darius Williams is, you need to be attacking. Right, if Darius Williams is on Jamar Chase, you can get the ball to Chase quickly, make him a runner, watch Darius Williams, who's 5'8", $180, try to tackle him. If Ramsey's shadowing Chase, we can hit 6'4" T. Higgins on slants and ins and let him box Williams out. We can hit Higgins on jump balls and watch him dominate. Chase and Higgins have to win every single time the ball's in the air and Darius Williams is in coverage. That's how this potentially has a chance to work offensively for the Bengals. That's really it.
When you look at some of the things that the Rams have said, Jalen Ramsey's been pretty outspoken that he wants to be matched up one-on-one on Jamar Chase to try and serve as the eraser in that matchup. And if that were to happen, you figure David Long most likely is tasked with covering Tyler Boyd coming out of the slot. And to your point, Darius Williams and T. Higgins will get to know each other all too well over the course of 60 minutes. But I think you brought up an excellent point. You've been banging the drum saying that Troy Reeder was a liability, and it's not lost on the Rams. Eric Weddle played every single defensive snap in the game against the 49ers. So what did that mean for Weddle coming into the Super Bowl? He is now being given the green dot. He's responsible for lining up everybody on the defense. So as a result, it allows the Rams to be much more multiple with their linebackers and keep a guy like Troy Reeder, who'd been tasked with that responsibility, off the field at key junctures of the game.
Yeah, it's huge, right? I mean, Troy Reeder's, it's a nice story, right? Undrafted free agent, and we know the Rams don't allocate a lot of funds to the linebacker position because they are a little bit more analytically savvy, and this is an area that we broke down in the San Francisco game and said, hey, let's attack the middle of this field. But all of a sudden, if you can implement Ernest Jones back in there, who a lot of the players, specifically the veterans, Ramsey and Donald, were raving about his insertion into the lineup pre-Arizona game where he had the big interception inside the 5 on Kyler Murray, he went down with an injury. So he was able to work his way back, took some light snaps in one game, had a little bit more responsibility against San Francisco. Now they're expecting, with 2 weeks off, a little bit more of a larger role. And he's just younger. He's quicker. He's faster. He can move sideline to sideline. Getting Ernest Jones back in there certainly helps the middle of the defense as opposed to Troy Reeder, who you would be attacking at any point, right? If we're going to get Boyd running routes into the middle, we're going to get Uzama running routes in the middle, we're going to running backs, whether it's Pirine or Mixon, we're going to make Troy Reeder be a pass coverage linebacker, and that is just where he's horrific. So I think that is a big get. Now, again, what does this mean for C.J. Uzama? That's great, right? All the Bengals fans went nuts. He threw off the brace. This is a multi-week injury. If this were the regular season, as I mentioned, would not be playing. So what does that mean? Is he going to play a couple snaps? Is he going to go out there and find out he can't go? It's difficult because that is the one guy that helps you disguise things. If not, this becomes even more paint by number for this Bengals offense. We're going to line up in 3 wides. We're probably not going to have a ton of protection on the field. And this just becomes how quickly can Burrow get it out of his hands? How well can Higgins and Chase dominate? That's really the only avenue that this offense has right now.
The Drew Sample slander around these parts is nothing short of incredible when you say that they can't operate without a tight end if there's no CJ in the mix. But while Payne, the Bengals offense, obviously, Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase are the headliners in the passing game. Joe Mixon put together quite a outstanding season in his own right, but we've seen a lot of his rushing numbers become less and less efficient up until last game against Kansas City, where he finished with a shade under 90 yards. When the Bengals have the football on offense and they're not throwing it, how effective can they be running the ball, whether it is Joe Mixon, Samaje Perine, or anybody else who may get a carry on Sunday?
Yeah, I don't know if Samaje Perine's going to get a carry, although that would be interesting to get wild and change things up if you have Perine on the field on 3rd down. Maybe give him a handoff from time to time to disguise some things. But this kind of was my point, is if Zach Taylor is going to go uber conservative and make this a Canadian Football League game, right, and have Burrow just operate on 2 downs, 2nd and 3rd, and we're just going to hand the ball off to Joe Mixon every 1st down like he did against the Chiefs, it's not going to go very well. This is a completely different defense. We saw against San Francisco, that was the one area where they had been a little bit weak. They were challenged by Raheem Morris, and they came out and they stopped the run. And so what we have seen from the Rams defense is they've been very, very good stopping the run on 1st down. Again, number 1 in EPA per rush on early downs. They are 6th in defensive rush efficiency on 1st down specifically. And so you really wonder where this ground game is going to come from the Cincinnati Bengals, and if that allows them to be a little bit multidimensional. I don't see that being the case. I really don't. So maybe the offensive line over the next 2 weeks, here's how they're the weak link, and we get this anomaly performance in a 1-game sample where they're the best run blockers in the world. Maybe that's the case. If that's the case, then the Bengals have a chance here. But I just don't see that predictability mixed in with the matchup advantage the Rams have along the defensive line being something that leads to Mixon having a ton of efficiency. Now, he might get a ton of carries early on as this game's close, but the efficiency probably isn't going to be there. I would expect Zach Taylor to get other guys involved. We've seen Jamar Chase take a couple carries, a la Deebo Samuel. Not as many, but he has been, getting the rock as a running back a little bit, and that's one prop that we have seen take some heat over the last week or so from professional bettors. Jamar Chase over 2.5 rush yards. It's why it's out to 4.5 now at this point. So that would be interesting as a way to get Jamar Chase in this game a little bit more as well.
Yeah, should be interesting to see how flexible the Bengals can be, what kind of wrinkles they'll put in the game plan, because to your point, we know there's that high level of familiarity, and if Cincinnati remains predictable in everything they do offensively, I'm not sure this game will go any better than when these two head coaches matched wits and the Rams completely clamped down in what I believe was a 24-10 final. Now, of course, a little bit different dynamic as Joe Burrow has more experience under his belt. There is, of course, the other side of the ball, and we'll get to that in a second, but did want to try and take a second now to kind of ask you, more comprehensive questions. When you're talking about professional bettors and the way they go about approaching the Super Bowl with a menu that'll rival that of the Cheesecake Factory in terms of ways to try and bet the game, is there anything you can share with our listeners who might be in a new state with legalized betting for the first time that are just trying to devise a game plan, get into attacking the extensive prop menu and trying to figure out how to maximize some of their handicapping and homework that they're inevitably going to put in before kickoff on Sunday?
Yeah, there's a lot of things. I mean, as I kind of mentioned there, right? Not a ton of value in the side or total. It's one game. You would hope after 20 data points that sports books are capable of putting a good lineup on this game, and they've done that. So how else are you going to attack? And it's certainly through the prop market, although they've sharpened that market throughout the years, right? They have data. Now they are able to profile players, and they can see which props delivered the highest rate of returns and where they're a little bit weak, so they can adjust year over year. But by and large, props are the way to attack, and certainly there is, a decent method of, if you like overs, you're going very early. If you like unders, you're waiting on some of these player props. Someone like Cooper Kupp, who we'll get to here in a minute, opened 102.5. Do a lot of pro bettors love that number? No. Our median price on him was like 98.2, but we know where the market's going. And so we have an idea that this might get to somewhere in that like 111.5, 112.5 range. And so now you've worked a middle, or you hold that bet because it's great. And now Higbee gets announced out. And so routes and target distributions change a little bit. I think the one thing, though, that you always want to have in mind with the Super Bowl is you need as many outs as you can get. This is very much a decentralized market. And you and I, Todd, were just looking at this prior to recording. But someone like Cam Akers, who has been steamed over 58.5, over 59.5, currently you can still get 62.5 some places. It's as high as 68.5 at Buckeye right now. So having multiple outs is vital. I think you also have to kind of keep in mind, and it's maybe not specific to this game, because there's a lot of just core players, and those seem to be the core players that are getting the vast majority of the work. But typically, this is the deepest playbook that we will see from either team all season, right, in this Super Bowl. It's balls to the wall. You have 2 weeks. You have 2 offensive minds. And so there's a little bit of a widening distribution at times when you look at game plans, play calling, and things of that nature. And typically most teams will get other guys involved. Although, again, as I said, this specific slate of teams typically just relies on their horses. I think that's also what makes this a little bit more difficult is, Higbee seems to be trending towards out. Uzama's claimed that he's playing from pretty much the onset based on his tweets. But what kind of impact does that have on some of the prop markets, right? Because those guys aren't available yet. But if Higbee gets announced out, it can mean more things for other receivers. If Uzama's announced in, but he's not effective, do we see his number get hit under from pros? Potentially, but what does that mean for the other guys? There's a lot of ways to kind of go about this, but when someone hangs 400, 450, 500 different props with all your outs, there's going to be errors in 500 offerings versus just the books putting a line on the side in total. So that's typically where the vast majority of our bets will come on the Super Bowl. I think our portfolio is going to be a little bit lighter this year compared to past Super Bowls, but the props are where the largest edges are for sure.
It's always interesting because I think when you try and break it all down, there's no doubt causation, and that every offensive play that goes to one skill position player means one less opportunity for other players to touch the ball, not only on their team, but also on the other side. So when you begin to try and take the numbers and build out what odds makers think is a logical way for the game will play out, to your point, there's inevitably going to be a mistake or two that are made. The market has grown significantly more sophisticated than it was years ago when I was behind the counter at Caesars, and there were a lot more things for folks to pick off right away. As you continue to have data, you continue to have more extensive player prop offerings on a weekly basis, and I think the interview with John will kind of peel back the curtain a little bit there and give people a better understanding of exactly what we're getting to. But we did only cover one side of the ball, and that was talking about the Bengals offense against the star-studded Rams defense. When you're looking at the Rams offensively, Matthew Stafford, one of 6 quarterbacks in NFL history with multiple seasons of 4,000 passing yards and 40-plus touchdown passes, that has him in rarefied air with Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, Peyton Manning, and your beloved Dan Marino. Of course, the only thing missing from his mantle coming into this year was a playoff victory. Now, of course, he has a chance for that elusive Super Bowl and can shed that tag that's unfairly been attached to him as an underachiever, as the head man for the Detroit Lions. When you dig into some of what Stafford has been best at this postseason, it's pretty simple. When the game has mattered most, that's when Stafford's raised his level of play. He led the Rams to 13 points late when they trailed 17-7, erased the 10-point deficit, which contributed to the biggest comeback in championship game history. In that span, he was 11 of 14 for 121 yards and 1 touchdown. And for Matthew Stafford, he had struggled under pressure this season. He's eviscerated the blitz. He'd struggled against zone coverage throughout the regular season. But when you look at his passer rating in the postseason, 113.5 versus zone compared to 89.5 during the regular season. Where do the Rams, in your opinion, have an advantage when it comes to throwing the football against this Bengals defense?
Specific to the Rams passing against the Bengals secondary and defense in general, I think, when you look in its simplest form at its core, the thing Cincinnati's defense does is the way you want to defend Matthew Stafford theoretically. And you hit on that there at the top, right? You don't want to blitz Matthew Stafford. And the Bengals, bottom 7 in blitz rate this season. In the playoffs, you look at Lou Anarumo, he only sent blitz on 15% of opponent third downs. So they've kind of got that element of the defense down pat with how you want to defend Stafford. On the season, though, if you look, Cincinnati's played an above-average rate of zone coverage, and all the rave, like the last 2 weeks, right, was about Lou Anarumo's rush 3 and drop 8, and where he effectively had Sam Hubbard, his defensive end, drop into coverage after he reads pass, since he played with 3 safeties on the field, and Lou would basically have Von Bell crash down into the middle of the field. In the Chiefs game, Bell would crash down in the middle of the field, kind of eliminate some of those crossers, those middles, eliminate Kelsey a little bit as that help defender. He also acted as a spy on Mahomes. Now, you can't spy Stafford with this kind of. I wouldn't think you don't want to spy Stafford, obviously.
Well, you can spy him. I'm not sure it'd be in their best interest to eliminate Matthew Stafford's legs is a huge component of what the Rams want to do offensively.
Right. And so I think when you look at the rush 3, drop 8, it could work. Right? Like Lou does a pretty good job in that in terms of morphing from man to zone. Did use that more man in the second half against the Chiefs, knowing how they were calling the game, that these refs weren't going to impact things. So he's like, hey, we're going to use a little bit more man. But typically, he is going to use a touch more zone. I think after 2 weeks of film, you would understand that using a little bit more zone against Stafford would be the right approach here. We talked about that in the 49ers-Rams game 2 weeks ago. So first, you can't blitz Stafford, right? His EPA jumps to a positive 0.53 EPA per pass to about an even mark when not blitzed. Yards per pass attempt increase 1.2 yards. His success rate surges 14% versus the blitz. Bengals don't blitz, check mark. You talked about Stafford in his zone. Rating dips 42 points on our numbers against zone compared to man. He makes far more mistakes. EPA drops, touchdowns drop, interceptions increase versus zone. We know Stafford likes to show off his arm talent from time to time. completely understandable. Fits balls in spaces that probably shouldn't be attempted by most quarterbacks. So when you drop more guys into coverage, Stafford's production dips a little bit. So if Anarumo goes with his rush 3, drop 8, and it's more of a zone concept, that's the best way to potentially hinder Stafford, right? 3.9 yards an attempt on 49 dropbacks against just 3 rushers this season for Stafford. Small sample size, but certainly enough to incorporate in your game plan. Now, I do think if the Bengals are showing heavier boxes on first down, that would be the time to pass, right? We know the Bengals are super sensitive to play action, bottom 5 defending it. They're also 32nd in defensive pass efficiency on first down. But at the end of the day, right, like you can do all the quirky things you want with your scheme, but a lot of this comes down to the Jimmies and Joes, right? And if you're looking, the Rams right now 5-0 against pass defenses, 20th or worst in efficiency this season. Bengals are 24th. And so if Anarumo with his rush 3, drop 8 do slow down Stafford a little bit, I think it does open some things up for the Rams running game, Todd.
And when you speak about the Rams running game, it's largely been bottled up over each of the last couple of weeks, but clearly a step down in class when you go from playing the Tampa Bay Bucs defensive front, the 49ers defensive front, versus what they're going to encounter in the form of the Cincinnati Bengals. Cam Akers, he's averaged just 2.8 yards per carry this postseason, led the team in rushing each of the last 2 games. Sony Michel has kind of been the forgotten man, just 11 carries for 20 yards over the last 2 games. But he is the guy that was the bell cow throughout the regular season, has a little bit more experience as far as having actually played and won a Super Bowl as a member of the New England Patriots. So if you're the Rams and the Bengals elect to go with this rush 3, drop 8 type approach, do you think we see a much more concerted effort from this Rams offense to giving the ball to Cam Akers, running the ball and trying to pick up 4 or 5 yards, setting up 2nd and 3rd and shorts?
One thing I think have to give McVay a lot of credit for is mixing up the game plans the last 4 weeks. So it's really kind of tough to anticipate what he's going to do here. But if you look in 2 of the games, he's been super run heavy. The other 2 games, he's come out and attacked through the air with Stafford. If you look at some of the early down run rates the first 3 quarters over the last month, like you're looking at like a 52-48 early down split of pass to run. So he's been very balanced in that sense. I think this is interesting, right? There are some obvious avenues for Cooper Kupp and OBJ, the way he's coming on now that he's acclimated into the offense, and Stafford has been very good in certain instances. But when you look at opponent and you start to think about McVay at times, how you can get a little squirrely when the stakes are high. And then if we see this rush 3, drop 8, I think we could see a fair amount of running early. And it would make sense to test that when you hit it perfectly. You're dropping down in class against the Bengals run defense. If you look at the last 4 weeks, the Rams have faced the 49ers run defense twice, the Cardinals with J.J. Watt returning, and the Buccaneers with Barrett, JPP, and Levante Davis all back in the front 7. For the entire season, those 3 defenses are 2nd, 3rd, and 7th in EPA per rush allowed on early downs the first 3 quarters, and that's including games where some of those horses were out that I just mentioned were turned into the front 7. The Bengals run defense, 28th in that metric. And if you look at the playoffs only, 61% of early down runs against the Bengals defense have graded successful. League average is about 49% for context, okay? This, to me, is the reason we have seen Cam Akers rushing props get smoked from the open of like 58.5 to 59.5, and now we're in this wide range of 62.5 to as high as 68.5, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. I would say 64.5 is now pretty much the consensus, depending where, I think that's probably the right consensus number. McVay did not want to run away from Cam Akers after his fumbles. It is clear he feels Cam Akers their most dynamic back. Everyone is yelling, right, how inefficient Akers has been without putting it in context that he's faced fantastic run defenses the last 4 games. Akers has 2 weeks to rest his body. He goes from facing, run defenses top 4 in early down efficiency the last month to the dead last Bengals since week 8 in early down run efficiency. And you think about this game where, the Rams are a 2-1 favorite. So both the matchup in the game script makes some sense for Akers, and I think the Rams running backs will have success. Maybe Sony Michel gets in the end zone. Henderson is trending towards being back. I don't really think that's going to be a thing. it seems that McVay wants Akers to be his bell cow. It's his most talented running back. And it would appear that he's going to have a pretty good game here. I know a lot of sharp guys took some flyers on Akers to win MVP because of it.
When you talk about Cam Akers and obviously his limited effectiveness from an efficiency standpoint, do you have any concerns at all about the shoulder injury that had him miss some snaps against the 49ers? Do you think 2 weeks is more than enough for him to be able to drop his shoulder and use some of that power and burst that we grew accustomed to last year when we saw him burst onto the scene?
Typically, you would have some question marks, but he returned to the game, right? So I think that's always one thing you're monitoring with some of these injuries is, did they return to the game? Now you have another 2 weeks off. It would all lend itself towards Cam Akers having a big role here. Now, certainly we've seen down in the red zone areas where Sony Michel's had some carries as well, and I think that's, some guys who are thinking a little bit more outside the box have discussed some things on Sony Michel potentially in terms of rush yards, but I don't know what that distribution is going to look like. McVay has kind of pounded the table and said Akers is his guy, right? Fumble inside the 5 before the half against the Bucs, fumble late in the game against the Bucs, and then the game plan is specific to Akers against San Francisco, but the touches get a little bit distorted because he's out for multiple series. So I think he is going to be the workhorse here. It's certainly nice to be able to rely on a Sony Michel. It's nice having Henderson back, right? As many knives and weapons that you have in the Swiss Army knife that you got, like that's a positive here for a game like this. But I think Akers is kind of his guy. And over the time, right? I know Todd Gurley's a little bit different of a back, but I mean that's always been his bell cow. Even you go back to the Super Bowl against the Patriots where Gurley's talents are a little bit diminished and he's also injured, right? It's the Gurley show. So he seems to like having one back. We also see these situations where McVay doesn't necessarily go tempo. He loves letting that play clock run, but he kind of speeds you to the line initially thinking it's tempo, so your defense remains the same, and then he calls the play from there. And that typically means the same running backs on the field throughout of that driver series. So that's one thing to monitor here. And again, there's going to be opportunities, and this goes back to attacking props. Like, we think the market is a little inefficient because Cam Akers hasn't shown to be efficient. Well, why isn't he efficient? Well, he's played, 4 of the best run defenses, and his numbers are a little bit distorted here. So that is the reason for the Cam Akers over money from pros. We'll see how high it can get. My feeling is we're going to see a different viewpoint potentially, especially if this. I mean, again, Buckeyes, it's 58 or 68.5 right now. So where does that go to get a different mindset? Could potentially come from the same guys that went over 58.5. So it wouldn't be a bad middle there. And again, as we sit here and talk about these props, it's always important to remember that like the lower the prop number is, the more valuable the yards are, as opposed to like seeing something go from, a receiver, right? Cooper Kupp going from 102.5 to 104.5, virtually meaningless, but a Joe Mixon receiving yards going from 29.5 down to 26.5, big deal. Right? Like it's far more valuable, those 2 yards.
When we go back to specific position players, there was one guy that I wanted to ask you about before we close the book on the Rams, and that would be Odell Beckham Jr. When you look at Odell so far this postseason, 19 receptions, 83% catch percentage with his 19 receptions on 23 targets, tied for the highest by a wide receiver with a minimum of 20 targets over the last 30 seasons. Looked a lot more like the dynamic wide receiver we'd grown accustomed to during his time in New York with 9 catches for 113 yards against the 49ers. But we've obviously seen books start to adjust up with Odell. You could have had him early in the postseason with totals, I believe, in the high 40s. The numbers have inched up accordingly. How do you go about attacking a player like that specifically? Not necessarily with an opinion one way or another, but just knowing that the market has climbed with his increased productivity, but with the questions that we addressed with Tyler Higbee, not knowing where Odell and what his role will necessarily be.
Yeah, that's certainly where you find some of your edges. And I'll be candid, I didn't go to the well with an OBJ ticket last week because I kind of got in my head that the number, or his price rather, had jumped too high from week to week. And you start to dig in and you just understand that he's being targeted more. 11 last week. Certainly the looks that a defense is going to give you bodes well, I think, for OBJ. So it's difficult, right? So I'm sitting here on the left side of my brain saying, I understand that OBJ to start the playoffs had a number at like 49.5. And I understand last week he was a little bit higher than that. Now all of a sudden we've jumped into the mid-60s. In saying that, our number on him is like 71.1. It's not enough to go over in the mid-60s for us. That just kind of gives you an idea how much value and edge we need to get into these props. So 5 yards isn't enough for us. But I'm certainly not running to go under. And it'll be interesting to see, because I do get the mindset that, and I'm kind of hearing through the grapevine that OBJ could be a guy that's signaled out to go under on game day as his number increases a little bit more. I don't know if I will join that party. I do think there's a lot of game script for him, right? If the Rams are winning, if the Rams are having success running on that rush 3 drop 8, suddenly the receiver props just based upon volume isn't going to get you there. So that's going to be the interesting dynamic of some of these Rams receivers props. It might not just be because the Bengals defense in their drop 8 coverage is giving them fits. It could just be because the game's a little bit lopsided.
Well, it makes a ton of sense. And I think, when you look at players, you try and figure out how overvalued or undervalued recent data points will be. As we know, current form is definitely indicative of what you can expect to see from a lot of these guys on big stages. So it's always a fascinating discussion to figure out if the market has reacted enough or if it hasn't reacted properly to what players are putting forth with the most recent games that we've seen on tape. We've broken down both sides of the ball, both from the Rams offensive and defensive perspective, as well as we have from the Bengals side. Now, rather than listening to us drone on, I think it's important to get a man who's dealing all of these props to his customers and his perspective on things. He joins us for the final time this football season. You, of course, can follow John Sheeran on Twitter at JSheeran. That's JSHEERAN1981. And John, it has been a long, strange journey, my friend, and I have to think that when we were talking about Super Bowl possibilities way back in early September, none of us envisioned the Cincinnati Bengals being the representative out of the AFC.
You're 100% right, Todd. I think they were the same. We look back, they were after week 2 or 3, they were the same price as the Jaguars to win the Super Bowl. And I guess how those two teams have trended differently this season.
When you look at the way things have kind of played out, I mean, some books out here have reported they took a handful of tickets at 150 to 1. Obviously not any liability. Did you guys see any money come in other than from the recreational bettors on Cincinnati to win the Lombardi Trophy way back when?
Not really, Todd. I mean, the usual narrative that you see with Super Bowl futures is when teams are hot, everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon. So as they kind of progressed through the season and Burrow started to, light up a little bit and they got hot offensively, then certainly, at some of the prices all the way down, we would have been taking some action. But as you allude to, a pretty good result in the futures book for us, as you can imagine. And we were pretty high on the Rams at the start of the year. Them and San Francisco, probably the two we wanted to keep for ourselves, and largely managed to escape on them as well. So we're in a good position going into the game on Sunday, from a futures perspective at least.
Never a bad situation to be in. To book that future book accordingly and take full advantage. I definitely know when we talked about the Rams and the landscape in the NFC West early in the year, I think you guys were even higher on the Rams than we were, and Payne has kind of been the leading cheerleader for Matthew Stafford during his time in Detroit in terms of getting a bad rap along those lines. I'm going to give Payne the floor to ask some of the hard-hitting questions as they pertain to the props, John, but so much of what we do here is kind of pulling back the curtain, allowing our listeners to have access to information that they don't get anywhere else. Can you kind of walk them through what the process is like before setting that opening number for the Rams and Bengals once you know that's going to be the Super Bowl matchup, and what may take place on the trading floor in the 24 hours before the market truly sets?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting time for sure. Obviously you're working through it as the 2 championship games play out, and you have your core ratings, and we have our home field advantage, if you call that, for the Rams anywhere, but for SoFi, and really that was a quick decision, a quick conversation where we wanted to settle, and we opened at 4, and we were pretty happy there. I think most other places were 4.5 at that stage, and yeah, I don't think that we necessarily envisaged the money come for the Cincinnati Bengals in the way that it has, but certainly confident in the number itself. I think, X's and O's perspective and even my own personal opinion, I'd probably be a little higher, but I understand, why we landed on 4. And when you look at the numbers, I doubt very many people will be, a million miles away from that number either.
It's such an interesting game for all of those reasons. And I know Payne and I touched in great detail about how difficult it's been trying to quantify some of what the Bengals have done so far this postseason. And then to see the public start to gravitate towards the underdog leaves you scratching your head. But we know that narrative can drive quite a bit of the storyline and some of the betting dollars in a game like this. But Payne, now you get to ask John the questions our listeners are really curious about hearing when it pertains to some of the prop markets and everything going on at FanDuel.
Yeah, before we get there, John, how many years have you been behind the counter for a Super Bowl?
Good question. I've worked for a bookmaker for 15, 20 years at this stage. Obviously, the Super Bowl has only really been the top priority for me since I came to the US with FanDuel. So you're talking, 18, 19 and to today. So whatever that is, 3.5 years or so.
Makes sense. And kind of give our listeners a peek behind the curtain. Like, how involved are you in the team with kind of creating and shaping just a ridiculously large prop menu?
Yeah, it's a huge, we have a spreadsheet that contains all of the props that we've offered, and that is a pretty expansive spreadsheet these days. We've kind of iterated on it as we've gone through the last few years in the US. And even beforehand, we had an even broader one, to be honest. We didn't have, the regulatory requirements or the obligations with the league. We're not permitted to offer anything to do with officiating as a directive from the league, and we understand why that is. And, in each individual state, we also have requirements about what we can offer and what we can't. So you'll see the Gatorade, in New Jersey, but you may not see it in Virginia and so on and so forth. And that's probably been the biggest challenge, Payne, where, we want to offer a hell of a lot, national anthem, first song, color of ties, all this sort of fun stuff. But unfortunately, hands are tied right now. But that is something that I think we'll see develop over time as the kind of industry matures and, regulators are more exposed to what it looks like and maybe don't have the same integrity concerns they do right now.
Makes sense. And even with some of those being excluded from your prop menu, and I know you're obviously growing substantially, so it's hard to maybe count this, but what are you looking like at this stage for a Super Bowl in terms of side total versus prop action? What percentage does that look like for FanDuel right now?
You're the second person to ask me that question this week, and I didn't have the answer for either of you. I think looking at it historically, there's obviously a big drop off. The demand for the props is obviously huge. I think we have in excess of 550 markets available right now. So, you're talking about a hell of a lot of volume that wouldn't be necessarily there for a regular or even an earlier in the playoffs game. So I would say you're probably, down to maybe 60% of your handle going through the core markets when, that is certainly, well north of 75 on a normal game. So a pretty substantial difference.
It makes complete sense. And before we get into some of the specific players in this game, I know our listeners are like, get to it already. But we just have this idea where we kind of not want to focus on one specific game and teach people kind of how to fish for a lifetime. What are some of the types of prop bets that you see pro bettors routinely hitting versus the kinds of props that maybe your more recreational bettors are making for the Super Bowl?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think there's certainly been, I would say, a drop off over the last few years in what we see from sharp bettors on our props. I think, some of that is to do with, there's now more volume going through all the player props, for example. And, we feel like we do a really good job on improving our pricing over the last 3 years. And the prices we offer, I think we're about the only book that offer 20-cent lines on player props on game day in the NFL, certainly in the US. So, we're confident now, and I think we've gotten better and paid more attention. We've certainly invested, odds making skills and analytical approaches to it. And, we have a really good team in number fire of quants that we use. And, those guys are really spitting out really positive numbers. So I think, that's certainly been one area where we haven't seen maybe everyone waiting for people to hang the number, everyone wanting to bet the unders. We've seen a ton of money for Cooper Kupp's over. We've only ever been 103 and 104.5 the days of expecting to get 110 or 112 just because of volume, certainly for us, are long gone. So I think those opportunities are becoming less frequent. I think there's certainly some of the other edge case props that we have lower limits, and frankly just nowhere near the same levels of confidence. Everyone's talked about the touchback this week. That's certainly one that we got hit on at plus 150 all the way down to, I think, about plus 105, plus 110 now. So certainly some people on a bit of a narrative value, if there's such a thing. Interesting to see how that one plays out. But yeah, I think, lots of the edge case props, people definitely have, spent more time researching them than we will as we hang them.
There's no doubt. And what's interesting for me is like our props portfolio this Super Bowl is smaller than usual. And part of that, I think, is a little bit of the matchup, right? The Rams and Bengals really rely on their heavy hitters. And then part of that is some question marks around Higbee and Uzama and what that would mean for, route and target distribution. But I think the other piece of the pie you hit kind of in the last question, and it's basically the FanDuels of the world who have this extensive prop menu year round now. And you did mention number fire there. From a bookmaking side, can you talk about like how helpful it is to have season-long data when creating and managing Super Bowl props and its kind of impact on shrinking the edge for some of the pro bettors?
Yeah, incredible. I mean, we've just continued to accumulate all that data and reference points. I think, historically you'll hear about bookmakers and odds makers in the US. What price did this market close last year? And that's where we open it up. And obviously, may have very little relevance given the different matchups. So, I think that's certainly been an area where we've mined all that data. The analysts and quants that we have with the traders and their experience and knowledge, I think is something that, you couldn't really do a good job with hanging these props and laying a decent bet if you're not heavily invested in that space. And like I said, it's something that we've been very conscious of, not just for Super Bowl, as you mentioned, but all season long, and indeed even bigger data banks than that.
Now, you mentioned Cooper Kupp. He is arguably the most talented player in this game. The season he's having is historic. You mentioned opening at 103.5. Some other shops did open 102.5. Where are you guys right now? And what's the plan of attack for Cooper Kupp in terms of continuing to get pummeled early on from sharp bettors? And specifically, I think you're going to get hit with more recreational money towards the weekend. What do you plan to do with that number?
Yeah, we're not looking to move it. We're at 104.5 now. We've only moved it up a yard. I think it's 8. I think I checked yesterday. I think it was 16-1 to the over in the money that we've taken. That'll only swell even further. But we are going to, we just think these numbers are just a little bit too high. We're happy at 104. We're happy to accommodate people. And yeah, Cooper Kupp's had an amazing season. Wouldn't surprise me to see him sail over. But yeah, we do not really plan on moving the number. We're kind of happy to build the exposure at that number and, see how it goes. Similar with Beckham. We think that one's too high as well. So, for us personally, there'll be a lot of unders bets on our side, and we may have to watch it from behind the couch. But certainly not looking to move it just because of weight of money.
I think that's interesting, and specifically to Cooper Kupp, our median number on him this year is like 98.4. So even at 102.5, the guys that I work with went over, just knowing that they would be set up for a middle. Now, let me ask you this. I know you don't anticipate moving this number, but is there something internally you guys might do if Higbee is out, knowing that that might up Cooper Kupp's target distribution, specifically over the middle of the field where the Bengals are a little weak? Is there any plans if Higbee's out that we will manually adjust Cooper Kupp, not just based on the money that we see coming in, but obviously a key component to the offense being out?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it exactly right. The distributions will change. If you take Higbee out, he will be linked to Cooper Kupp. So certainly those targets will obviously go across the team, but certainly we'll have a change in Cooper Kupp. We haven't necessarily had a discussion. We don't really need to. Those distributions are in the model. Those players are linked to each other. And when and if he was ruled out, that will be redistributed and recalculated off the model. So not really a conversation, certainly aware of it. Like you said, there will be an element of it. They will have reduced the percentage share that we expect Higbee to get in anticipation that he may not play. So we're probably halfway between, where he would be in and out. So you'll certainly see some movement should his status change.
You mentioned OBJ and liking the under a little bit there, and I think he's an interesting player in this game from the standpoint of, if you're just looking at his market price this week, substantially higher than it's been the last two games. But obviously there is this element of him being integrated into the offense a little bit more, taking over for Van Jefferson completely, and he's flourished in that role. So what's kind of the balancing act of knowing that, hey, we're looking at a guy at 64.5 now. He was priced in the low 50s last week. Certainly, a massive move there, but also kind of figuring out like, hey, now he's fully integrated in the offense, and some of the numbers we have when he first got to the Rams are pretty much irrelevant.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Again, I mean, that is exactly the way we think about it. There's an additional weighting to his recency, and I think that makes perfect sense. Like you said, he came in, he didn't know the offense. He's gradually played a bigger part as the season has gone on. So, yeah, there will be an element of discounting his earlier performances, but I think all those numbers are well baked in now. Like you said, I think there's a narrative about this as well that has it artificially high, and from that perspective, again, we're super happy, to lay the overs if the Rams go off. I mean, we talk about liability and exposure on these props individually, but the vast majority of our risk will come from same game parlay, where everybody obviously is kind of the compounding element of Kupp going over, Beckham going over, Stafford with that, and then a win for the Rams, and where that really ends, God knows. But there's certainly that element in our mind, although we try to exclude it. We don't really charge a tax for that. Like, obviously there's enough juice or vig in the same game parlay as you basically pay vig on every leg you add, and that's kind of the way parlays work in general. But we're certainly not mindful of jumping them by yardage just because of that kind of risk that we have of exposure. Kind of land on the number that we want to be on. We'll respect the bets we see, obviously, particularly from the sharper bettors, and make those minor adjustments. But we're pretty confident in the numbers that we've hung. With Stafford, I mentioned there, we've taken almost $250,000 off one customer at 278 and 280, and we're really only at 281.5 now. So for a bet that size on a player prop a week out, to be only kind of 3 yards away from where you're opening, I think kind of illustrates the point.
Yeah, and for our listeners' sake, like when you're dealing with numbers that high, substantially less valuable than, say, a Joe Mixon going under 29.5 receiving yards versus where he sits now at 24.5. Have you seen anything on running backs or potentially any other players that's sharp or may lead you guys with some liability come Sunday?
I think Cam Akers is really interesting, Payne. We certainly saw some demand for him very early on, maybe high 50s up to 60. Yep. Obviously, he's trended up since, and I think there's a bit of a potential for some sharp play on the under now. So he's one that we've respected initially. Some sharp bettors definitely very early on last week we're betting Cam Akers over performance. It's not hard to see it. There's lots of game states, I think, where you're in the realms of that number and even beyond. And maybe if they build a lead, then obviously that one will look really, really good. So yeah, that one was probably the major one we saw with running backs. Like you said, saw some sharp action for some of the under receiving yards on both sides as well. So plenty of action on all of it, I think.
One thing I want to do before I kick it back to Todd, because I know we're running a little bit long here. Anything on the total? We saw this on the Sunday night it was released, got as high as 50.5. There was some sharp money under, and then it trickled on again on Monday. Have you guys seen any of that?
I think we were a little bit under. I think we might have opened 49 or 49.5. We sit at 48.5 now. Really good two-way action on it so far. It's almost 50-50. It won't be a big decision for us. Really can't see it move at all. Maybe a half a point to the under. I think there certainly seems to be a little bit more demand for the under. I think, again, game state, and you think about how this game might play out, and I think, again, there's lots of game states where the under may look a decent bet, even if it's some high scoring from the Rams initially. But I don't expect it to move. Based on what we've seen, we're very happy with it. Really don't have a desire to move at all. But like you said, if anything, maybe a half a point down.
And John, last but certainly not least, there's obviously a very real human element to all of this. And I think a lot of our listeners imagine on Super Bowl Sunday, you're sitting in the office with countless spreadsheets in front of you, trying to figure out exactly what every play means to the bottom line. How do you go about watching a game of this magnitude, knowing that it's the crown jewel, not only as a sports fan, but obviously for the betting industry and what it means to the company's bottom line?
Yeah, look, we're lucky. I mentioned this a few times all season long, Todd, that the idea that I have to sit there and sweat the game. Look, this is a big game for us, particularly when you think about same game parlay exposure in. I think we could have exposure in same game parlay in an Armageddon scenario. If this was to get into the 40s on both sides, you're probably talking about a couple of $100 million in risk. So I just find that I have to detach myself to watch it. I mean, we'll deal with that headache when and if it comes on the Monday morning. And I don't have someone looking over our shoulder on Sunday night saying, how much does that touchdown cost us? There'll be a few text messages, don't get me wrong, but for the large part, try and kind of ignore that and deal with it in the aftermath and enjoy the game. It's such a big event. It comes around once a year. There's no point me, or any of us sitting in the office. We can't control it. We've done our job, and it's kind of wash our hands of it and come back to it on Monday morning.
That's good to hear, because I can tell you what you guys will do in terms of handle, and the win-loss on the balance sheet would dwarf the numbers that I used to see behind the counter at Caesars. And that was always the first thing that we had to do once the game went final, was go through and tabulate every single prop, break it all down, put it on a spreadsheet, and more or less have it to the casino executives by the time we closed up shop that Sunday night. So it's always different, and good to hear that when you do this for a living, and that's the entire organization's bread and butter, that you get a little bit of breathing room and everybody understands, hey, these guys have done their jobs all year long. We're going to trust the process, and we're going to root against it being a 42-36 type shootout where every single same game parlay comes home to roost.
Yeah, look, we're lucky. Like I said, that the company that we work for is so big that we kind of get away with having that approach. And yeah, exactly as you said, trust the process, deal with it on Monday, and put it to bed. And there's a long season ahead of us beyond it.
Hey, John, I can't thank you enough for all your contributions throughout the course of the regular season. I know it adds an element to this podcast and creates a little bit different perspective that Payne and I can offer up. Hopefully the listeners have been gracious with their interactions on social media with you throughout the course of the campaign. And again, best of luck on Sunday. And hopefully for your sake and those folks behind the counter, the game ends 3-0 and we won't root for a Bengals moneyline victory to create more liability.
That would be the perfect case scenario, Todd. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Not sure, Payne, I can thank John enough. I know we always appreciate his contributions, but for what he's meant to the podcast all season long in terms of adding that extra dimension that takes what we do day to day and raising it to the next level to make our listenership that much smarter when they approach each and every wager that they're making.
Yeah, and it's not just for this podcast. A lot of our listeners don't know this, but we chat with John probably 45 minutes to an hour in pre and post production, and it's always good chatting games with him. He's become not just a member of Bet the Board, but a friend of ours, and so I think that's been awesome, and we're happy to see him get his shine. Rumor has it, right, he's been requested a ton since being on this podcast. I've seen him do some hits other places. I know he's got some big hits coming up this week, so it's good to see him being recognized based upon him joining Bet the Board. But I will say this. He said that he might have a headache if things don't turn out his way. My understanding is he's going to have a headache Monday morning either way, because he's going to be doing some drinking at the game. So whether it's a bad result for the house or a too much consumption of adult beverages, I think he's a favorite for a headache come Monday morning.
There's no doubt the man will keep himself busy, and it's definitely warranted for the hard work he puts in, week out throughout the course of the season, and obviously everything that goes on behind the scenes, not only from the content he provides on this podcast, but what goes into setting some of the numbers and making sure FanDuel has as extensive a menu as they possibly can, as they continue to expand into new states. And the reason I bring that up is because it's always important to add another out, to Payne's point. So FanDuel provides the perfect avenue for you to bet some of your props in time for Super Bowl Sunday. We encourage all of you to go to FanDuel.com, use the promo code BetTheBoard, take advantage of their menu there, whether it's alternative spreads, whether it's alternative totals, anything you could think of, FanDuel has made available to you, in addition to your $1,000 risk-free bet, and of course, your 56-1 odds that are available should you pick the Super Bowl winner. But Payne, alas,
if you forget all of that, what Todd said, the link in the description to sign up is it's like literally in the podcast description.
Yeah,
so if you forget what the code is, you just click the link in the description. They're in every podcast.
The same way that you're going to lay out the terms and conditions of our lovely contest that we're offering up in time for Super Bowl once again.
I forgot about that already. $300.
You got the memory of a goldfish these days.
Super Bowl podcast retweet giveaway. It's on Twitter. 3 people will win $100 each. All you have to do is retweet the pin podcast posts on our Twitter feeds. Again, I'll have one, Todd will have one, and there'll be one on the Bet the Board Twitter feed. If you retweet all three, you get 3 entries into the $300 cash contest. If you only retweet it once, so be it, but you only get 1 entry. So you can earn up to 3 entries in the contest by retweeting all 3 podcast Super Bowl posts from each of the accounts. We'll divulge the winner at some point during the game. Maybe it's a couple minutes after the game, depending how good it is. But we will announce it on Sunday at some point.
Yeah, and I'm making the executive decision now, and I know I didn't clear it with you, that even if you enter 3 times, no one person can win the contest 3 times in the simulator.
There you go.
So that way we can share the wealth and distribute accordingly.
There you go. I like it.
But obviously, the more chances you have to enter, the better chance you have to win. So, Payne, for the final time this fine football season, it's all about where we can go for an investable opportunity, and it has been arguably one of the best that we've put on the books around these parts. Well north of 60% success rate with our best bets. Hopefully a harbinger of things to come, not only for Super Bowl Sunday, but exactly what kind of content we'll provide as we move forward into football season 2022 and beyond. But where have you found a couple of edges that our listeners can exploit just in time for the big game?
Okay. So thinking about this out loud, and feel free to chime in at any point here, Todd. We don't necessarily have a best bet, right, on the side or total. It's one game. As I kind of alluded to, we priced this at Rams -4.5, -115. The market's at 4.5. There isn't a ton of value there. However, and I'm sure you've heard it over the years if you've listened to this podcast, and so that means you've heard it other places as well. But sometimes with the money line, there isn't the fair distribution to price. So at 4.5, you're looking at what should be like -205 on the no vig line. There's a lot of -190 out there on the Rams. I'm going to wait. If I can get the Rams -170, I'll probably have a value bet on the Rams money line at -170, 175, 180, somewhere in that range. We also do some things with prop bets. Obviously, you can't get as much down on those. So there really isn't a best bet, but I'll just tell you things that we have bet that are widely available that you can bet yourself and just kind of clue you in here. So again, if the Rams get to like somewhere in the -170, 180 range, that'll be a bet for us. One thing that we have also bet, Bengals, first scoring play to be a field goal, +160. There were some better numbers out there. It was as high as 3-1. Still see value here for a number of reasons, right? Obviously, McPherson is the talk of the town, but he's got a monster leg. He's healthy. He's a guy that can hit a field goal from anywhere. But moreover, if you look at the Bengals offense and how it's been trending, their last 7 scores to start the games, not at home, all field goal. So we don't think the market really priced this out. You can have drives where the Bengals are driving deep in territory, and you can get, 2nd and 7, and all of a sudden the offensive line breaks down in that matchup of the Rams' vaunted D-line, and suddenly you're staring at 3rd and a mile, and really Zach Taylor's going to call a draw there or a play to stay in field goal range. So we like that prop. We think that was way off.
And by the way,
Bengals
I haven't really chimed in. I'm trying to keep my mic muted as best I can, as I don't know what the hell's going on outside my office right now. So rather than picking up some of the background noise, that may be why I'm a little bit more quiet than what I think people would expect for me to interject with some of these. So I'll let you continue on your diatribe, but I just wanted to jump in with that.
Beautiful. Bengals first drive, punt, -110. We like that one a decent amount. That is still available. Going to throw a curveball here. Mickey Guyton, national anthem. Over 100 seconds. We're not going to dive into that one. We're going over. Rams more first downs. -150. We think their offense has some edges. We think they're going to be on the field a little bit more. They're certainly the favorite here. Again, this is another way to potentially attack the Rams while not laying the current -190 on the money line. So Rams more first downs, -150. The other thing which we're waiting on, and I'm going to be a good soldier here and get yelled at because we've been waiting to bet this one, but we'll give it out now. Probably might be able to get it higher on game day, so there might not be a rush for this, even if it trickles down after we give it out, it has a chance to kind of bounce back. I do think it'll kind of remain in this range. We're going to go with Joe Mixon under 64.5 rushing yards. Again, he's probably going to get a decent amount of carries on first down. We're just hoping for them not to be efficient carries. And based upon the matchup, we wouldn't expect them to be. Based upon the predictability and 2 weeks to prepare for the predictability, there probably won't be overly efficient runs from Joe Mixon. And then at that point, if you're looking at the game script, we see a team that's favored by 2-1 on the money line. It would indicate that the Bengals are potentially playing from behind. We've also seen Joe Mixon come off the field a great deal on third down where they rely on Samaje Perine. So we, at this point, don't have an every down running back in Joe Mixon. When we are handing it off to Joe Mixon, it's been on predictable first downs where the Rams defense has been quite good. So those are like the 5 prop bets that we have bet and are still within range. And again, if the Rams get to a money line in that minus 170 or 180 area, that's going to be a bet for us as well. Not the size of a normal best bet, but would present some value to where we have some funds allocated there.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Obviously, when you have the laundry list of props that are available, you try and identify some of the small edges. We know limits aren't quite the same for those as they are for a week-in, week-out basis in the National Football League. So for those folks trying to properly address and display good money management, allocate accordingly and make sure you don't overextend yourselves. And we say it all the time, and I know it's not a fun discussion to have. It's just another football game. The money is as green as what we'll find in the preseason next year and what we give out on college football first half totals throughout the course of the regular season. So play smart, play responsibly. But Payne, man, that menu you gave out will give our listeners a lot to chew on and hopefully plenty of ways to keep themselves engaged from start to finish on Sunday afternoon.
Yeah. Wish everyone the best of luck. It's been a great season regardless of what transpires in the Super Bowl. Remember, it's just one game. You don't get bonus points for betting and winning the Super Bowl. This is no different for us than a MAC game on a Tuesday night. That's kind of the reality, other than the large offering of props. But in terms of like side and total, if your edge isn't there, it doesn't mean you need to bet more because it's the Super Bowl. So just kind of a little fatherly PSA there.
Be interesting.
But it should be a good game.
Be interesting if you got bonus credits based on the magnitude of the game and how accurate you were with side or total, with a graded scoring system of sorts. But thankfully for the betting market, that isn't the case. Want to encourage all of you, our loyal listeners, follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, though, for all things contest related and announcements that we'll inevitably have between now and the resumption of the Bet the Board podcast during March Madness, at Bet the Board Pod. And Payne, before we close up shop and put a bow on what has been a phenomenal football season by all accounts and metrics, do you have any show recommendations you'd like to offer up for our listenership as they try to bide time over the next couple weeks in February where they go through a heart-growing fonder because of absence from Bet the Board?
I don't venture out into a lot of new projects, so I'm back into Billions, which is tough to discuss without giving a spoiler, but it's a little bit different this season. We'll just leave it there. Peaky Blinders is on the way, which I'm looking forward to.
I may have to give that another shot. I watched a couple episodes, a year and a half ago, was not blown away, but because you sing its praises every time we chat, I may have to dive back in and give it a second stab.
I thought we had this discussion.
We probably
have. You have to watch it with captions.
That might make it easier to understand Cillian Murphy.
Yes.
That is for damn sure. So that could probably be the veteran approach. Kind of like watching Snatch.
I told you this last time, too. We discussed it.
Yeah, but I don't listen all the time.
So my dad hated the show. And then I told him, watch with the subtitles. Now he loves it. So, yeah, there's a lot of, language. Not just the language barrier and the accents, but there's a lot of, quibs and there's a lot of sayings that you would never really understand if you didn't have subtitles on. But it's a great watch, and it's coming back for a final season.
I guess the Irish dialect a little tougher to pick up on. So that is good veteran advice. But we say it all the time, every time we do one of these podcasts, and obviously when we take a short leave. Can't thank all of you enough. Our loyal listeners that have tuned into the podcast 3 times a week during the regular season, both pro and college football. Continue to retweet, like, and share with your friends, family, and colleagues. And one final time, encourage all of you to go to Apple Podcasts, podcast. Rate, review, subscribe. 5 stars go a long way in terms of helping us gain a larger footprint. It gives us better opportunities to circulate the podcast and also give back to you, our loyal listeners. So thank you from all folks at Bet the Board. Wish you guys nothing but the best of luck on Super Bowl Sunday. And for the final time this football season, hopefully we'll see you at the window.